July 12th, 2008, and the interviewer is Brenda Hepler. All right, so Roger, what are your first childhood memories of libraries?
I grew up in New York City, and we had local libraries in town. It was one of the Carnegie libraries. It was called the Blay Place Library, which was the street it was on. It was probably a mile or so from my house, and I would either take a bus to go there, even though I was a young kid. Everybody in New York City took buses or subways. It was a small library, but it had been built under the Carnegie endowments for libraries. I didn't know that at the time, but my mom told me about that afterwards, after I became involved with the library out here in Lafayette. She explained that it was one, because she had one in her town, which was in Sandusky, Ohio. The other libraries, of course, were at schools, and I remember my mom volunteered at the elementary school library, so I used to get to see her, which I guess I was young enough that was a good thing to have your parent at school. It wasn't like being in high school.
Yeah, right. So where did you grow up then?
So I was born in Manhattan on the east side, Upper East Side, in an apartment that somehow my dad found when he was in Italy during the war. He met a family there that owned property, very convoluted. But pretty soon after, when I was getting close to kindergarten, we moved to Queens. And that's where I primarily grew up, was in Jamaica, Queens. It was in a community that was built for the United Nations, actually. The diplomats lived in Manhattan, and the staff for the UN lived in this community in Queens. And how my dad found it, I have no idea.
And what awareness of community did you have while growing up?
It was New York. You took subways into the main part of the city, and you lived out in the boroughs.
Yeah.
My dad worked at NBC Television, and so I grew up in Rockefeller Center pretty much. That was the center of the universe for us.
Not a bad place. And just to backtrack, in your library, when you were going to the library, what kind of books did you love? Did you have any favorite childhood books?
No, I remember having books like the Hardy Boys and series, and I used to like to read series. Those are probably the main ones. I suppose I liked science fiction at the time too, because I was a budding scientist, and the 1960s and all were amazing times. It was when we were preparing to go to the moon and Telstar, and lots of science and technology was happening. So I used to read things about science.
Yeah, good. And your education then after high school?
So I went through all the public schools in New York. They were interesting places, but our school it was a very diverse school. Came from the poorest place in the community and the wealthiest place in the community. It was a real mixture, but it had a strong principal who was very interested in science, and I was interested in science, and I knew I wanted to do physics in college, and ended up going to Princeton, where they have a strong physics department, and becoming a physics major there.
And then you continued your education?
So I continued. I actually ended up not liking the people in the physics department. They were too theoretical for me, so I spent a lot of time in the engineering school at Princeton, which is where I met my wife. And at the time, the environment was becoming a very interesting issue. This was in the early 1970s, and we actually met in an environmental center, which 35 years ago knew about climate change, and we were involved in projects there. Why it took so long to really enter the consciousnesses of people is hard to believe, but there was a center there that was focused on this kind of thing. So we met there. I liked engineers. I liked my wife. It seemed like a good thing. So both of us came out to Stanford for graduate school, both in engineering. So I switched over to engineering at the time. And then after graduate school at Stanford, joined Berkeley in the early 1980s, where I've been ever since.
But don't you teach physics?
But I went back to physics, that's right. So I see a continuum between basic science and technology, and I think that's where the interesting activity is and maybe where my skills are is at that interface between science and technology, and so I can flip back and forth.
Yeah. Good thing to be a flip-flopper sometimes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no one knows where you are really if you're always in between, right?
As an adult, what were your early community experiences?
Gosh, I think the first thing I remember doing was having some political events for people running for city council and school board at our home. I had friends who...
And where was this?
That was in Lafayette here.
Okay.
So when we came to Lafayette in 1983, at the end of 83, I remember that because we moved into the house right at Christmas time, and it was one of those big freeze years, and the pool outside had frozen, and so when we bought the house, we suddenly inherited this ice rink on our pool. We had to come up every day and chop it. But anyway, we were in the transition there at Christmas time. But early on, we had friends who were running for school board, running for city council, and so we would have fundraising events for them here at the house. Of course, when you know people in politics, they tend to suck you into it. So when that school board member decided 5 years was enough of service or so, tapped me and said I ought to do it, and so I got involved with the schools through the school board.
Ah, great. And what attracted you to Lafayette in the first place?
My wife was working at Sandia National Laboratory in Livermore. I was at Stanford at the time as a research fellow, and I got the offer to come to Berkeley. And so somewhere between Berkeley and Livermore, we knew we had to live. We looked in the hills and around Berkeley for a while because that seemed appealing. My wife said we needed to find a place with flat enough ground that she was pregnant at the time with our daughter, and she said we needed a place that was flat enough that the kids could learn to ride bicycles. So we didn't do too well in the hills of Berkeley, and kind of on a whim came out to Lafayette, found a place right away that was flat, and moved here. As soon as we did, though, we were looking at a giant map of the area and saw that right running through our house was a giant planned freeway. And it was the freeway that they had planned to build here, and we got a little worried, but it was explained that in fact that had been canceled as a project, and so we were fortunate to not have that. But we came here because it was halfway between Berkeley and Livermore, and it was flat.
And defining the goals of community as a place of mutual support, shared values, and the acceptance of difference, how do you see Lafayette meeting those goals? There be difference, mutual support, and shared values.
Well, the community, what are we, 25,000 people or so now, has an enormous sense of pride in its schools. People volunteer for lots and lots of activities, but the town has pockets of diversity. It's not so obviously diverse as a place like Berkeley or a big city, but the attention that people pay here to the fact that we're on the BART line that connects us with the rest of the world, the fact that we have strong support systems for people with handicaps that are very visible in the community, the fact that we have schools that so many people volunteer at and have a focus on important activities. It isn't just Friday night football here. It's theater and arts, science. I think people pay attention to the important things.
That's terrific, yeah.
One of the activities that I was proud of on the school board that we got a lot of community support for, there's been always a lot of concern about science and the difficulty of teaching science in the schools. And one of the things we did was to get community support behind hiring a science teacher in each of the elementary schools, which we have now. And so there's a science laboratory, which is a science teacher's classroom, and it's a place for kids to go. And the teachers are the Dr. Sciences of the schools, so they're a resource for the teachers. And just the fact that the community would recognize this as a problem, get behind us, allow us to devote resources from the district to this to solve a problem, which is that it's hard to teach kids science, and yet it's very, very important. And the fact that everybody would get behind that is kind of a sign of people's interest in solving important things.
Thank you. And how do you feel a library serves a community?
With the whole way the community, the library happened, I think illustrates it. We knew that a library was a gathering place for people, whether it's school kids after school or older people on Saturday mornings or meetings that a lot of the community comes to when authors come to town, and it's a meeting place for that, or it's the pajama-rama or something. This is where the school kids come in their pajamas and listen. It's a gathering place for discussion and exposure to new ideas. But if you look at the way the library happened, the siting of the library, we knew we wanted it to be, it was critical that it be near a school within walking distance, right? So that was one of the constraints. And so we identified the Veterans Memorial Hall as the site. And what all happened? Well, we turned that around, that difficulty, because there was a building on the site, and how were we going to work with the veterans? They were very tied to that site. And what we ended up doing was working very, very closely with the veterans to build them a new building, the Veterans Memorial Building. And I have heard and believe that it's the only new Veterans Memorial Hall built in California in recent times. These were all happened after World War II when everybody was trying to celebrate the veterans. But the fact that we built such a beautiful building and such a functional building for them, and it's a building that is sufficiently capable of generating revenue that it will be sustained forever. The fact that we took this desire to build a library and then turned out to sort of double the feedback, the positive activities to the community here was just sort of endemic of or emblematic, I guess, of the way the community will take a problem and address it in an extraordinarily positive way. So we have the new Memorial Hall. It will exist forever. It honors veterans, and it spills over. Now we have the Crosses of Lafayette. It's just a way that even a small community can reach out, and the library was the genesis of all this. So good things came of it in many ways.
And just for the sake of this interview at this point, when this planning was going on, your role?
So I was on the school board at the time, and we knew that the schools and the libraries had to be close. There was a library bond measure that the voters in California had passed. We started to realize that in town, I think there was a realization that we wanted to apply for money under the bond measure for the state, and it was critical that the schools be involved if we were going to be able to apply for the bond money and win the bond money. And so I became the liaison between the school board and the library planning group, and that was my first introduction to the library.
Okay. Any stories at this time? Anything that comes up to mind?
I remember walking around town with the library planning group and my daughter. She was in high school at the time, and I just remember walking around with the mayor and the city manager, and I'm on the school board. We had a group of about 15, 20 people, and a few kids like my daughter tagging along, wandering around town saying, well, this block looks really good for a library, or this one does, and no, this one's owned by somebody, they probably won't sell to us, right? They have a business there, or they're planning to build a house there or something, and it was very organic or something to just wander around and say, well, that looks like a pretty good place, and so that was fun.
That was great. Okay, now with your involvement from this point on to the school board, and then you're not on, are you still on the school board?
No, I'm not. So what happened, a lot of people in town were doing work on the application to the state for the bond measure. Paperwork was, I don't know, 4 or 5 feet high. I remember just all the data they needed to consider our activity. But we had been sitting around talking about how the schools could be strongly involved with the library. And at the time, I still do, I chair the faculty advisory committee to the Lawrence Hall of Science Center associated with UC Berkeley. And I said that one of the great things about the Lawrence Hall of Science is that they brought programs to the schools. Sometimes they come out and they'll bring furry animals or some static electricity experiment or grossology or any of the wonderful projects they do into the schools. I said, why don't we get them involved in an after-school activity that would be at the library for the school kids so that there can be hands-on science after school. It would be a good attractor. So everyone thought that was a great idea to cement the relationship between the library and the schools through some group like Lawrence Hall of Science as a program developer. A bunch of other people on the committee said, well, you know, if the Lawrence, and I took this back to the Lawrence Hall of Science director, who I knew very well, and she just said immediately, yep, sign us up, no question. They wanted to be part of this. So when that response came back, I think the group recognized that this was an idea that could expand, and the idea of the consortium was born because people said, I know this group, I know Cal Shakes, I know Oakland Museum. And people went out, talked to the groups. They all wanted to sign up, and the consortium was born. And when that idea was presented in Sacramento, so I was part of a small group of people that went up to Sacramento to request the bond money. When that idea was presented to the people on the bond committee, which included a lot of legislative people, it was a winning idea. No one else had that idea. It was an extremely dramatic day. I don't know if you've heard the story of that. But so Steve Falk and Groden, maybe a half dozen of us went up to Sacramento.
Was Bob Fisher involved?
Bob Fisher was absolutely critical to this consortium idea. He was the main person who went to the other organizations and signed them up for it. Bob didn't come with us to Sacramento that day, but we had made a visit to Sacramento earlier to, and a lot of people had done this on their own as well, talk to legislators to find out what was important to them for this bond measure. So we've done a lot of background work in finding out what was going to be important in the judgment. But it came all down to that one day where there was a hearing. The Library Bond Committee sat there on the dais, a couple hundred people in the audience from all over California, small groups like us representing towns or cities that wanted to build new libraries or expand or renovate libraries. All were given about 10 minutes to present their case, and it just went from 8 to 5 in the day, and it was going bump, bump, bump. Everybody got their 10 minutes. We had practiced, we had a script, I read the script, and we all wore sashes which said Lafayette Library on them. We were very cute, the way we looked. We'd come early, so we were in the front row, and we got our 10 minutes sometime in the afternoon. But the bond money was over, the requests were way in excess of the money that could be given out. So we did our 10 minutes. It sounded pretty good. People seemed to be excited about it, but we didn't know. We were just part of a large group of people all asking for this money, all with somewhat clever ideas, but ours was particularly clever. The consortium idea that reached out to the broader community, connected the urban and the rural, or the urban and the suburban. And it was about 5 o'clock. They had given away most of the money, and we didn't know where we were because there was a little bit of money left. And one of the legislative people put together a proposal because they were stuck, right? It's hard to give away that last remaining dollar that they had and who they're going to give it to, so many needy causes. And somebody bundled us together with a branch library renovation in San Francisco, a new library for a rural community that never had one, and then Lafayette Consortium. Bundled us together, which, lo and behold, our total request happened to end up the last dollar there. And so the committee at 5 o'clock at the end of the day just said, sounds great, passed it, and there we were. So it was an extremely dramatic ending to the day, and so we drove home just feeling great. Everybody on their cell phones calling Lafayette to say we got it. So that was the thing that really put us over the top, because we had the strong community support in fundraising that had raised a lot of money. A third of it the city had committed to, and this other third, which from the state, really just put us over the top. And so the library, we knew then we could do it.
That's terrific. Now, your participation obviously was, you were very involved, and some of these questions I'm not going to ask you since you've covered the subject, but why did you want to participate in this development? What was the urge, for you to even to get involved? I mean, you were on the school board, but and this new library, why was it so important to you to even want to participate?
Well,
Was
I
the
grew up.
driving
I grew
force?
up in New York City, and New York is an absolutely wonderful place. There's a sense of community, many communities, because you're in a pocket. There's of course a sense that there's no way you can touch the entire community there. I mean, 8 million people, but you could, in your local neighborhood, you could isolate yourself and be part of it, and it might be a candy store or something that you congregate at, or a restaurant or so where you see people that you know. But I guess that sense of a small community there, it was almost of necessity that you tended to isolate yourself in a small community in the city, just to give yourself some sanity in a place where there's 8 million people. And I never thought I would end up in a suburb. And that's right, my parents were definitely provincial New Yorkers. I still on my wall have that New Yorker magazine cover that shows New York City and just Badlands west of the Hudson River. Anyway, ending up in California, ending up in a suburb was not what I had in mind. I suppose the thing about Lafayette in the library part of it is that it was something that allowed us to, we've tried in town, I think, over time to find a sense of community, whether it's the park right on Mount Diablo and Moraga Road there, a little windy for places for us to congregate at. But this was finally a place where we could all congregate, give that sense of a neighborhood. It seemed like an interesting thing to try to do.
What have you enjoyed the most in your participation in this endeavor?
It's got to be the people. I mean, I've met so many interesting and committed people who volunteer for the library, or people just to talk to. You talk to anybody in town about the library, everybody wants to hear about it. Everybody wants to figure out a way to participate. Everybody wants to give you new ideas, and new ideas are needed. But everybody's got some idea that the library, something the library should undertake. And I don't think that's ever going to go away. It's not, when we finish the construction, it's going to be just the beginning of the place, because people are going to generate even more ideas. It's hard to generate ideas now. We don't even know what it's going to look like, really, or how it's going to function. But the fact that people have so many creative ideas about what to do when they can't even see it, I think it's going to just continue to expand. People are, and the question is, how agile are we going to be? Building is static, but the ideas are going to be, I think, just pouring out. And the question is, how agile can we be as a community to have the library be the nexus of those ideas?
Thank you. That is terrific. So, just not to be overly redundant, but what values did your contribution touch that you hold dear? In other words, in all this, what values did you grow up with?
Early on, when I started this, I had a lot of conversations with my wife about themes that kind of define why we're doing something. Because you're constantly challenged to say, why do this, why do that? There are just so many opportunities in life to do stuff. And, I don't really remember whether it was my wife or myself who came up with this, but it seemed to me there was a common theme among the activities that I did, which involved schools and libraries and museums. So I teach at Berkeley, I was on the school board here. This museums, I chair this advisory committee at Lawrence Hall of Science, and I've been involved with Lawrence Hall of Science for years. And that's a science museum or science center. And libraries were just an extension of that. So schools and libraries and museums are all part of what I would call cultural genomics. And the idea of cultural genomics is that you accumulate and interpret and preserve and pass on information. So the human genome is a way that everything that makes us human gets passed on to future generations. And the genome encodes for everything that we do, that we are, how our bodies function. It's the template, the architectural plan for humans, or for any living creature. So if schools and libraries and museums are kind of the cultural genomics, it's the way to accumulate information, to preserve it, to interpret it, and pass it on. And so there is a common thread there of schools and libraries and museums, and that's what cultural genomics means.
Yes, well, and here we are. I think you've touched on this, but if you want to elaborate a little more, what is the most exciting to you about the new Lafayette Library? You've definitely touched on it, but if there's anything else.
So I'm on the board of the library, so I see a lot of different ideas coming in, whether it's the children's area or the public art part or the LASF room or the homework room where there's a place for kids. I mean, there's so many interesting aspects to it. The public art is going to be great. The amphitheater, the community room, the fact that the community room is also where the emergency preparedness work is going to go for the community. There's so many good things that are going to spring from it, and I suppose my focus has been on the potential for what we're calling a living media wall, which is going to be a place where information will be displayed and actively updated. Hopefully that'll be a place that everybody sees when they walk in the library, and they might just walk by it and see what's happening at the library that day, or they might stand and watch an art show for a couple minutes as they walk by it, or they might walk by it and see a more extended program on climate change that is like a Nova television show, not a real television show, but an exhibit that explains the nature of climate change over 2 or 3 minutes. Or they might stop and watch an impressionist art show that will again be a few minute display on this media board. So the media board will be a place of information and curiosity, driving curiosity. I'm not sure what it'll really be, and I suppose that's the exciting part of it. But we have this idea that there should be a place for curated exhibits that take advantage of modern technology. And I suppose I find that the most interesting part and something I can contribute to.
Why do you think the citizens of Lafayette have responded so enthusiastically to this new library project?
Well, they've been contributing to the schools for years, and they see that that pays off. And this is another challenge, and people are rising to the challenge. I think they appreciate the fact that this is broadening out Lafayette, that the consortium is a way of bringing in the Commonwealth Club and Cal Shakes, all these cultural organizations from the Bay Area, bringing them here. They see it as an opportunity to expand the historic support that they have for education in the community to a much broader set of people.
Yeah, and so just moving just slightly beyond that, then what, you really answered the questions, and I just kind of want to make sure I covered just a few more things. What outcome do you hope for the most with this new library?
I hope that in a few years, on a Saturday morning, I can go and sit in a comfortable chair and read newspapers from around the world in the library.
That's great. And relative to the library of the 21st century, how do you think this library is meeting the challenge of what a library is to be in the 21st century?
Well, let's see. The structure of the library, given all of the different rooms and connections we have made with the community, imply that the library is going to be a very dynamic place. And I used the word agile previously. I think libraries are going to have to be agile. We see that the commercial world has changed the nature of bookstores. Bookstores are now restaurants, online, places to sit and read, places that sell audiobooks and videos and CDs and reach out in many ways. So we see that the commercial world has changed the nature of bookstores, and I think the library has to be similarly agile in the way that it provides content to the community. I imagine that the librarians are now information specialists. We all know we can sit at home and Google to find something out. That just is the tip of the iceberg, though, in terms of real content and information. And most of us don't really know how to seek out information in an in-depth way. It isn't just Googling it and getting the top 10 hits. And I think we see that with schools now. If someone's writing a report, there's a tendency for students to not read the books or not read encyclopedias or not go to original references. And yet all that information really exists below the surface. And so I look to the people of the library, the librarians or the information specialists, to be resources for the community. That's going to be one of the most important ways I think that the community interacts with the library in the future, is that that people help us to seek out the information that we need. in many ways, information search engines like Google have expanded our capabilities to just sit in our home and find out things. But at the same time, those information engines are expanding their capabilities. The amount of information is actually increasing probably even faster than that technology is happening. The data that needs to be searched or digested or understood or put in a form that everybody can understand it quickly. And so I look for the people of the library to help the community find that information. It might come down to just helping people use search engines. It may come into more in-depth references that they can point people to, but I think that's the key for the next part of the century is going to be this agility of the library to adapt to what people will want, and who knows what that'll be.
Thank you very, very much. This is terrific. I'm going to stop right here.